You can wake up every single morning feeling rested, pour a cup of coffee, check your messages, and sit down at the kitchen table and feel completely, unremarkably fine, while your cardiovascular system is running a biological emergency response that nobody told you about. And after 60, that emergency response is happening inside arteries that are no longer engineered to handle it the way they once were. By the end of this, you will have something I call the MAW Protocol. Three specific changes you can make before 9 in the morning that directly target what is happening inside your vascular system right now during the single most dangerous cardiovascular window in your entire day. Keep that in mind while we go through what is actually going on. My husband nearly died from cardiac arrest 5 years ago. He was an overloaded entrepreneur, eating poorly, moving rarely, completely unaware that his body had been sending signals he'd learned to dismiss as stress. After that, I became genuinely obsessed with understanding what actually drives cardiovascular disease in people over 50. Not the polished brochure version, not the pharmaceutical ad version with the silver-haired couple walking on a beach, the real biological sequence of events. What I found again and again is that the most dangerous things are not the dramatic ones, they are the ordinary ones, the routines, the habits that feel like nothing because they feel like everything because they are just your morning. There is one villain at the center of this entire conversation, and it operates under a name that sounds too technical to be threatening: the circadian morning surge. Let me translate that into plain language, because once you understand what it actually is, every single thing that follows makes immediate sense. Every morning, approximately 30 to 45 minutes before your alarm goes off, your body begins a deliberate, programmed preparation for wakefulness. Your brain sends a signal to your adrenal glands, the small triangular organs sitting on top of each kidney, to release a wave of cortisol. Simultaneously, your sympathetic nervous system activates. That is the branch of your nervous system responsible for what most people call the fight or flight state. Blood pressure begins climbing, heart rate increases. Platelets, the microscopic clot-forming particles circulating in your blood, shift into a more activated, stickier configuration. Your kidneys respond to elevated cortisol by ramping up something called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, a hormonal cascade that causes the body to retain sodium and constrict blood vessels in order to increase blood pressure further. Every one of these changes is coordinated. Every one of them has a biological purpose. This is not your body making a mistake. For the vast majority of human evolutionary history, that morning surge was immediately met with physical activity. You stood up and moved, you gathered, you hunted, you carried, you walked. The pressure spike had somewhere to go. The mobilized energy was consumed. The system was used as it was designed to be used. In the modern world, and especially for people over 60, whose arterial walls have been quietly changing in structure for decades, that same surge now hits a body that is about to sit down, scroll through a phone, and drink hot liquid without activating a single major muscle group for the next 2 hours. The surge has no outlet. And that is where the damage begins, in ways that are almost entirely invisible until they are not. Think of your arteries like a garden hose. A new hose is flexible. When you suddenly increase the water pressure, the hose expands slightly to accommodate it. It buffers the spike. The pressure wave disperses. But a hose that has been sitting in the August sun for 30 years is a different object. It is stiff. It has developed brittle patches. When you suddenly hit that old hose with the same pressure increase, it does not flex and absorb. The pressure travels further, hits harder, and finds every weak point in the line. That is precisely what is happening in the arteries of most people over 60 every single morning. And three specific habits are amplifying the damage beyond what the morning surge alone would cause. We are going through all three, from the lowest impact to the most damaging. None of them are obscure. None of them will surprise you because they are exotic. They will surprise you because they are completely ordinary. Habit number 3, going straight to coffee without drinking water first. I understand that this sounds like a minor complaint from a lifestyle account. It is not. Here is what is biologically happening in your body during the hours you are asleep. before you ever get out of bed. During a normal night of sleep, you breathe out roughly 1 to 2 cups of water as vapor. Respiratory fluid loss is continuous and invisible. It happens with every exhale, and by morning, you have been doing it for 7 to 8 hours. You also lose additional fluid through a process called insensible perspiration, skin-level water loss that happens below the threshold of visible sweating, particularly in heated rooms or under heavy blankets. By the time your eyes open, your blood volume is already measurably reduced. Not dramatically, not in a way your body signals with thirst. Thirst sensation is significantly blunted in adults over 60 compared to younger adults, which is itself a documented and underappreciated problem, but the reduction is real and quantifiable. The technical term for this state is hemoconcentration. It means the liquid portion of your blood, the plasma, has decreased in volume, while the cellular and particulate components, red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, remain the same. The result is blood that is thicker, more concentrated, and more viscous than it was when you fell asleep. Blood viscosity is not an abstract concept. It is a mechanical property that directly affects how blood flows through small vessels, how easily platelets aggregate into clots, and how much resistance your heart has to push against with every beat. Now layer onto this the circadian morning surge we just described. Platelets are already in their most activated morning configuration, primed by the sympathetic nervous system to stick together and form clots. This is a holdover from evolutionary biology. If you are about to go hunting or gathering, having a primed clotting system means a wound is more likely to heal quickly. But in the context of concentrated morning blood flowing through arteries that may already carry some degree of plaque narrowing, that platelet activation becomes something else. It becomes the conditions under which a small existing clot can become a large one. The conditions under which a vulnerable piece of soft arterial plaque, not the hard calcified kind, but the soft inflammatory kind that is more common than most people realize, can rupture and trigger a blockage. This is the documented biological reason that cardiac events cluster in the morning hours. Research published in multiple cardiology journals and validated by data reviewed by the American Heart Association consistently identifies the window between 6 in the morning and noon as the peak time for heart attacks and strokes. One analysis estimated the cardiac event risk during this morning window to be approximately 40% higher than during the afternoon or evening. That 40% is not driven by what people are eating for breakfast. It is driven by the biological conditions that morning physiology creates and that morning dehydration makes significantly worse. And what does most of the developed world do in that window? Coffee. Immediately. Without water. Coffee is a mild diuretic. It tells the kidneys to increase urine output, which means water exits the body rather than entering the circulation. You are taking a system that is already operating in a dehydrated, hemoconcentrated state during the highest cardiovascular risk window of the day and delivering a substance that extends the dehydration. The caffeine itself provides cardiovascular benefits over time, and I am not making an argument against coffee. The issue is entirely one of sequence and timing. After 60, this specific sequence of events carries more consequence than it did at 40 because of what happens to the endothelium with age. The endothelium is the single-cell thick lining that runs along the inner surface of every blood vessel in your body, from your largest artery to your smallest capillary. In a healthy, well-hydrated state, the endothelium continuously produces a molecule called nitric oxide, which functions as the body's primary vessel-relaxing signal. Nitric oxide tells the smooth muscle wrapped around artery walls to release, to widen, to accommodate pressure. With age, endothelial nitric oxide production declines. Dehydration accelerates that decline further. The endothelial cells require adequate hydration to produce nitric oxide at functional rates. So morning dehydration, in someone over 60, is removing one of the primary biological buffers against the morning pressure surge at exactly the moment the surge is occurring. 16 to 24 ounces of water before your first coffee. That is the entire intervention for habit number 3. The water does not need to be warm, it does not need to be flavored, it does not need to contain anything. The act of delivering fluid to your circulation before caffeine directly addresses blood viscosity during the cardiovascular risk window, supports endothelial nitric oxide production, and partially restores the plasma volume lost overnight. It is not dramatic. It does not feel like medicine. That is precisely why most people do not do it. Habit number 2. Reaching for your phone within the first 10 to 15 minutes of waking up. I want to be precise about what this habit does biologically, because the explanation most people have heard, that checking your phone first thing stresses you out, is accurate but incomplete in a way that undersells the cardiovascular stakes. Here is what you need to understand about the cortisol awakening response, which is the specific, documented, measurable event occurring in your body every single morning, regardless of what you know about it or believe about it. In the 30 to 45 minutes immediately following waking, cortisol, produced in the adrenal cortex, rises dramatically from its overnight baseline. Studies measuring this response in controlled settings consistently find cortisol increases of 50 to 100% above baseline in this window. This is not triggered by anything you have done. It is circadian, meaning it is driven by an internal biological clock and will happen on schedule, whether your alarm goes off or your body wakes naturally. The purpose of this surge is to mobilize glucose into the bloodstream, activate the immune system's anti-inflammatory preparedness, elevate blood pressure, and sharpen cognitive readiness for wakefulness. It is your body's self-starting mechanism, and it is exquisitely timed. When you pick up your phone within minutes of waking, you are introducing a psychologically activating stimulus, an email requiring a response, a news story involving conflict, a social media comparison, a notification that creates urgency, directly into a cortisol system that is already operating at its daily maximum. The result is what researchers in the field of psychoneuroendocrinology describe as cortisol response augmentation, the natural awakening peak amplified by an acute psychological stress response stacked on top of it. Your adrenal glands have already delivered their morning cortisol payload. The phone gives them a reason to produce additional cortisol before the first payload has cleared. Think of the cortisol awakening response like a controlled burn, the kind that forest management teams set deliberately to clear dry brush before it becomes fuel for something larger. The burn is necessary, it is calibrated, it serves a protective function. But if you throw additional fuel onto a controlled burn the moment it ignites, it does not stay controlled. It becomes something else. And unlike a forest fire, you cannot see the arterial landscape it is moving through. What does chronically augmented morning cortisol do to the cardiovascular system over months and years? 3 things, each distinct from the others. First, cortisol causes immediate vasoconstriction. The smooth muscle wrapped around artery walls receives a signal to contract, which narrows the vessel diameter and raises blood pressure faster and higher than the natural morning surge would on its own. In someone with already stiffened arteries and already thickened morning blood, this additional contraction concentrates pressure in exactly the vessels that can least afford it. Second, cortisol directly impairs endothelial function by suppressing nitric oxide synthesis, and we have already established that after 60, nitric oxide production is already diminished. The phone check is removing a buffer that is already running low. Third, and this is the mechanism that receives the least public attention, sustained elevated cortisol activates a specific set of inflammatory signaling pathways, particularly nuclear factor kappa B, which you do not need to memorize, that directly promote the cellular processes underlying arterial plaque growth. Plaque does not grow at a constant rate determined purely by diet and cholesterol. It grows faster in environments of chronic inflammation. Cortisol-driven inflammation does not cause a catastrophic arterial event overnight, but it accelerates the biological clock on a process that is already running. We have been told for decades in every medical brochure, in every cardiology appointment, that the primary drivers of arterial plaque are dietary fat intake and LDL cholesterol. Those factors matter. They are real. But a review of cardiovascular research supported by the National Institutes of Health and spanning multiple decades of data consistently identifies chronic psychological stress as an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease. Independent means it causes measurable damage to the cardiovascular system even when diet is clean and cholesterol numbers are within acceptable range. A large prospective study published in The Lancet, tracking over 90,000 adults across multiple countries, identified high daily psychological stress as a predictor of cardiac events that remained statistically significant after researchers controlled for smoking status, body weight, blood pressure, and physical activity. The risk increase in the highest stress category, 23% above the lowest stress category. These were not people in extraordinary circumstances, they were people with ordinary lives and ordinary morning habits. After 60, the physiological problem with cortisol extends beyond its peak level. It extends to how slowly the body clears it afterward. In younger adults, a cortisol spike typically resolves within 60 to 90 minutes as the adrenal glands receive feedback signals to reduce production. In older adults, cortisol clearance slows, partly because liver processing of cortisol is less efficient, partly because adrenal feedback sensitivity changes with age. This means the biological echo of a stressful phone check at 6:30 in the morning can be measurably present in your system well into mid-morning. You have moved on from the email. Your cardiovascular system has not. There is a secondary effect of morning phone use that compounds this cortisol problem and is almost never discussed: light. The screens of modern smartphones emit light in the blue wavelength spectrum, which is the specific wavelength that suppresses melatonin and, in the morning, accelerates the timing of cortisol release. In a person whose circadian biology has already begun the cortisol awakening response, blue light exposure signals to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, your brain's master clock, that it is definitively daytime, which sharpens and in some cases accelerates the cortisol peak. You are not just adding a psychological stressor, you are also adding a biological timekeeping signal that tells your hormonal system to move faster. For people over 60 whose circadian rhythms are already showing age-related phase changes, tending toward earlier sleep and wake times, with less amplitude between daytime and nighttime hormonal patterns, this additional light and stress signal in the first minutes of the day can meaningfully alter the hormonal environment of the entire morning. Protecting the first 30 minutes after waking from psychologically activating content is not a wellness trend. It is a direct intervention in the cortisol augmentation mechanism during the window in which your cardiovascular system is simultaneously at its most cortisol sensitive and its most pressure elevated. The same content you would scroll through at 2 in the afternoon will land on a categorically different internal hormonal environment at 6:30 in the morning. The information is identical. The biological cost is not. Now we arrive at the habit that dwarfs both of these combined. The one that is so deeply embedded in the structure of a modern morning that it carries virtually no reputation as a cardiovascular threat. The one that most doctors have never specifically counseled against, not because they are negligent, but because the guidelines they follow have not yet caught up with the circadian dimension of cardiovascular risk. Habit number 1: sitting down within the first 30 minutes of waking up and staying there. I need to be precise about what makes this different from the general conversation about sedentary behavior, which most people have heard enough of to have become partially immune to it. This is not about sitting per se. This is about sitting during a specific biological window in which your cardiovascular system is least equipped to tolerate the absence of movement, and in which the consequences of that absence are measurably distinct from the consequences of sitting at any other time of day. Here is the physiological sequence occurring every morning in the body of a person over 60 who wakes up and sits down within 15 minutes. The cortisol surge fires. Blood pressure begins its morning climb. This is not approximate. It is measurable in real time with continuous blood pressure monitoring technology. Research using ambulatory blood pressure devices, small portable monitors worn across the day, consistently documents that systolic blood pressure, the top number in a blood pressure reading, rises an average of 15 to 25 millimeters of mercury above the overnight baseline in the first 1 to 2 hours after waking. In people with diagnosed hypertension, or in people with arterial stiffness even without a hypertension diagnosis, this rise can reach 30 millimeters or more. This is the morning blood pressure surge. and it is one of the most clinically significant cardiovascular measurements that most patients have never had taken. Cardiologists specializing in circadian medicine have identified the morning surge magnitude, not total blood pressure, not average daily blood pressure, but the specific size of the morning spike, as one of the strongest independent predictors of cardiovascular events in people over 60. A large multi-center study examining morning surge in hypertensive patients found that those whose morning surge exceeded 55 millimeters of mercury above their nighttime average had a stroke risk 2 to 3 times higher than those whose surge remained below that threshold, 2 to 3 times. From a measurement that almost no standard cardiovascular workup includes, and that almost no primary care conversation addresses, return now to the garden hose metaphor, because this is exactly where it becomes most important. A young artery, flexible, elastic, high in elastin content, responds to a 20 millimeter morning pressure increase the way a rubber hose responds to increased water pressure. It expands slightly, it buffers the spike. The pressure wave disperses across a compliant wall. But an artery that has been in use for 6 or 7 decades undergoes a progressive structural change. The elastic fibers within the arterial wall, primarily a protein called elastin, are gradually replaced by stiffer collagen fibers. This is not disease, it is aging. Some degree of this structural change is present in virtually every adult over 60. The medical term is reduced arterial compliance, and it can be measured objectively through a test called pulse wave velocity, essentially how fast a pressure wave travels through the arterial tree. The faster the wave, the stiffer the arteries. A stiff artery transmits pressure waves further and faster into the smaller, more vulnerable downstream vessels. The coronary arteries feeding the heart muscle, the cerebral arteries feeding the brain, the renal arteries feeding the kidneys. When you sit still during the morning blood pressure surge, you remove the primary natural mechanism your body uses to regulate and buffer that surge, movement-driven vasodilation. Here is how that mechanism works in specific terms, because the general idea that exercise is good for the heart does not do justice to the precision of what is actually happening. Your skeletal muscles, particularly the large muscles of your legs and core, function as a secondary circulatory pump. When they contract rhythmically during walking or any sustained movement, they physically compress the veins running through them, pushing blood back toward the heart and reducing the back pressure in the venous system. This reduces the resistance that the heart pumps against, which in turn reduces arterial pressure. Simultaneously, the mechanical stress of blood flowing past the endothelium during active circulation, called shear stress, directly triggers nitric oxide release from endothelial cells. Shear stress is the frictional force that moving blood exerts on the vessel wall. The endothelium is extraordinarily sensitive to this force and responds by producing nitric oxide proportional to the magnitude of the shear. More blood flow, more shear, more nitric oxide, more vasodilation, lower pressure. During morning sedentary behavior, shear stress is minimal. Nitric oxide production stays low. The muscular pump is inactive. The morning pressure surge, which your biology generated on schedule and which was designed to be met with movement, instead hits a cardiovascular system in its highest stiffness, lowest buffer state with no counter-regulatory mechanisms engaged. The arterial pressure concentrates rather than disperses. The heart works harder with less assistance. There is a specific anatomical consequence of this that concerns me more than the aggregate blood pressure statistics, because it is the mechanism behind the most catastrophic morning cardiovascular events. The coronary arteries, the vessels that supply blood and oxygen directly to the heart muscle, range between 1 and 4 millimeters in diameter. They are small. They operate under different mechanical rules than the large arteries because they fill primarily during diastole, the relaxed phase between heartbeats, rather than during systole, the contraction. This is an important distinction. During the morning blood pressure surge, heart rate increases and diastolic blood pressure rises. As a result, the duration of diastole, the time available for the coronary arteries to fill between beats, shortens. The heart muscle is being asked to work harder at exactly the moment it is receiving less filling time from the vessels that supply it. In a young heart with flexible coronary arteries and no plaque, the coronary arteries respond by vasodilating to compensate, increasing their diameter to maximize the blood they can deliver in a shorter window. This compensatory response is called coronary flow reserve. In older arteries, particularly those with any degree of plaque narrowing or stiffness, coronary flow reserve is reduced. The compensation is impaired. The heart muscle works harder in higher pressure conditions with a more limited blood supply during the first hour of every day. This mechanism is why cardiac events cluster in the morning hours with such statistical reliability that cardiologists have a clinical term for it, the morning hazard period. And it is also why the behavioral intervention of morning movement has an impact that is disproportionately large relative to how modest the activity actually is. A meta-analysis drawing from multiple large-scale cohort studies examining behavioral patterns and cardiovascular outcomes found that replacing 30 minutes of sedentary morning behavior with 30 minutes of light to moderate movement, not intense exercise, not gym training, but sustained walking at a conversational pace, was associated with a 21% reduction in cardiovascular events among adults over 60. 21%, not from a pharmaceutical intervention, from changing what a person does with 30 minutes of morning time. That number is large enough that if a drug produced it, it would be on the front page of every cardiology journal in the world. Because it comes from behavior, it gets discussed in wellness newsletters and largely ignored by clinical prevention guidelines. This is the mainstream betrayal moment, and I will say it directly because I find it genuinely fascinating in its absurdity. Standard cardiovascular prevention guidelines, including those published by the American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association, emphasize cumulative weekly physical activity targets, 150 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic activity per week, distributed across the week. That target is not wrong. The research supporting it is solid, but those guidelines treat all 150 minutes as interchangeable, regardless of when they occur. They do not distinguish between a person who walks for 30 minutes in the morning before sitting at a desk for 6 hours and a person who sits for 8 morning hours and then walks for 30 minutes in the afternoon. The biology of the circadian morning surge and its interaction with arterial stiffness makes these two patterns categorically different in their cardiovascular impact. Yet this timing dimension is almost entirely absent from standard clinical cardiovascular counseling. Your cardiologist will ask how many minutes per week you exercise. The probability that they will ask what you do in the first 30 minutes after waking up, the 30 minutes in which the morning blood pressure surge is at its peak, coronary filling time is shortest, and sheer stress-driven nitric oxide production is most needed, is very low. Not because the question is unimportant, because the guidelines have not caught up to the research and the research has no commercial sponsor pushing it into clinical conversations. My husband's cardiologist after his cardiac event was excellent. He was monitored carefully, his medications were adjusted precisely, and his lipid panel was reviewed at every appointment. The conversation about morning timing, about what the first 30 minutes of his day were doing to the arterial system that had already demonstrated it was vulnerable. That conversation happened because I showed up to an appointment with printed research. His recovery has been gradual, carefully supervised, and profoundly medication-assisted. Results vary enormously between individuals, and I want to be unambiguous about that. What changed for us was the understanding of the mechanism, the why behind the morning behavior pattern, because once you understand the mechanism, the behavior change stops feeling arbitrary and starts feeling logical, and logical behavior changes are the ones people actually sustain. Here is the MAW protocol. MAW, morning arterial window. The name is not poetic, it is functional. The premise is that the first 30 to 45 minutes after you wake up constitute a specific biological window during which your cardiovascular system is simultaneously at its greatest vulnerability and its greatest responsiveness to intervention. The window goes in both directions. The habits that cause damage cause the most damage here. The protective behaviors that benefit arterial health are most effective here. You have a morning arterial window every day of your life. The only variable is what you put in it. M stands for movement first. This means continuous, sustained physical movement beginning within the first 30 minutes of waking before you sit down for any reason, not a high-intensity workout. The research on morning blood pressure surge management does not require intensity, it requires activation. Walking is sufficient. Light bodyweight movement is sufficient. What is specifically required is the engagement of your leg muscles in a rhythmic, sustained fashion, because that is what activates the skeletal muscle pump, triggers baroreceptor feedback, and initiates shear stress-driven nitric oxide production in the endothelium. 15 minutes is the minimum threshold that appears in the research on morning surge blunting. 30 minutes is meaningfully better. If you have mobility limitations that prevent walking, range of motion exercises in a standing position engage the same feedback mechanisms at a lower intensity. The biological requirement is activation, not cardiovascular strain. Move before you sit. That sequencing is the intervention. A stands for away, specifically, away from any content that generates a psychological stress response for the first 30 minutes after waking. This means your phone, your email, the news, and any form of social comparison content. The reason this is the second component rather than the first is that movement partially offsets the cortisol augmentation from the phone, meaning if you have already moved, the cortisol double peak is less damaging. But the most protected version of your morning arterial window keeps both mechanisms separated from each other and from the circadian cortisol peak. 30 minutes of content separation is the target. The most common failure mode of this component is substitution, replacing the phone with a television displaying news programming. The format differs. The cortisol triggering capacity does not. Conflict, urgency, social comparison, and threatening information trigger the same acute stress response regardless of screen size. Away means away from activating content, not merely away from a specific device. W stands for water. 16 to 24 ounces, consumed before your first caffeinated beverage. The mechanism is the one we covered in detail: overnight hemoconcentration, elevated platelet stickiness, the morning cardiovascular risk window, and the endothelial hydration requirement for nitric oxide production. The temperature does not matter clinically. The timing does. The water must precede the caffeine, not accompany it, not follow it. If you drink water while simultaneously drinking coffee, the diuretic effect of the caffeine begins counteracting the hydration before it fully reaches your circulation. 7 minutes. That is approximately how long it takes to drink 16 ounces of water at a normal pace. You are not being asked to give up your coffee. You are being asked to separate it from water by 7 minutes. The single most common mistake that invalidates the MAW protocol is implementing the three components in the wrong order or simultaneously. Movement first, then the cortisol protection window, then water before coffee. If you drink water and then sit down to read your phone for 20 minutes before walking, you have addressed the third-ranked habit while leaving the first and second-ranked habits fully intact. The sequencing is not arbitrary. The biological events of the morning surge, the cortisol awakening response, and the shear stress-driven endothelial response are sequential and temporally overlapping, addressing the highest impact events, movement and cortisol management, at the start of the window, when those biological processes are most active, is the structural logic of the protocol. Addressing hydration simultaneously is practical because water can be consumed immediately upon waking, before lacing your shoes for the walk. These three components are not additive in a simple mathematical sense, they are synergistic. Morning movement increases shear stress and nitric oxide production, which reduces the arterial sensitivity to the cortisol-driven vasoconstriction that the phone avoidance is also protecting against. Water reduces blood viscosity, which increases the ease with which blood flow generates shear stress in the vessels, which further supports nitric oxide production during the walk. The three mechanisms reinforce each other, which is why the protocol produces effects that are larger than the sum of its individual parts would predict. Half of all men experience no warning symptoms before their first cardiac event: no chest pain, no breathlessness, no prior diagnosis. The first symptom is the event itself. That statistic is not designed to create panic. It is designed to describe what happens when invisible damage, the plaque progression, the arterial stiffening, the accumulated morning pressure surges, the years of compounded cortisol, build silently past the threshold where the system can compensate. The damage does not announce itself. It accumulates in the same quiet, ordinary mornings as the ones you are already living. The protection does not need to announce itself either. 15 minutes of walking does not feel like cardiovascular medicine. A glass of water before coffee does not feel like an arterial intervention. 30 minutes without your phone does not feel like a cortisol management strategy. These things feel like a slightly different morning. That is the point. The morning arterial window is already open every day. The biology is already happening whether you engage with it or not. The MAW protocol is the decision to engage with it deliberately. If you are starting the MAW protocol this week, movement, away, water in that sequence every morning, comment MAW below so I can see who is actually doing this, and subscribe because the mechanisms go deeper from here.